you very much for that introduction. It's tough to follow Disney, but I'm going to do the best that I can here because everyone likes John Deere tractors, right? So just before I get going here, a show of hands, how many of you are humanities majors? Quite a few of you. Really, my objective here is to tell you that it's going to be okay. You probably freaked your parents out by saying, I'm going to study history, or I'm going to study classics, or I'm going to study art history, or I'm going to do something like that. You're probably freaking out a little bit yourself, saying, what am I going to do? Maybe I don't want to be a teacher. Maybe I'm studying history and I don't want to be a lawyer. So what do I do with that? So really my intention here is to share with you that you can be a college student, you can study classics, and this is me here. You can be that, and 20 years later you can be employed. So it's going to be okay. And really what I want to do is just share a bit of my journey. I know the theme of today is crossroads, and probably a lot of the speakers that you've heard today are talking about different types of crossroads. And I started kind of thinking about this in terms of, well, I could just talk about all my time as an undergraduate, and then kind of extrapolate that today and say, well, here's specifically and tactically how I've used that in my job. Instead, I wanted to take just a small career journey to, again, kind of reinforce the fact that not all career journeys are linear, whether you know it or not, and I didn't know it. To reinforce that it's going to be okay, you can make decisions along the way, and that these choices are incredibly important. Some are more important than others, but I think part of what liberal arts does is give you the confidence to make those decisions and move on. And you're going to know a lot more about me after 45 minutes, and you probably want to know about me, but that's okay too. I think that's part of this experience. So I've worked at John Deere. I just celebrated my 15th anniversary in May. And if you ever would have told me that I was going to spend 15 years at one company, I would have told you were crazy, because when I started working at Deere, I looked at a lot of people who had 30 or 40 years in, and I thought, that's incredibly pathetic. What are you doing? You're not taking any risks. There's nothing challenging in that. Here I am 15 years later, and I'm really thrilled that potentially I could retire with 30 or 40 or 50 years in a John Deere in a variety of different roles. So 15 years, I've had 6 different jobs at John Deere. Currently, I'm the manager of corporate archives and history. What that means is I really like old stuff, and I get to do stuff with old stuff all day. So that means that in this particular job, I'm responsible for the corporate art collection, which is about 3,000 pieces of art dating back, back to Roman coins that we have in the collection, the contemporary art that we purchased a couple of years ago. I'm responsible for the company's historical equipment collection, 400 pieces of a walking plow built by John Deere in 1853, to combines and tractors and excavators and bulldozers and everything in between, to managing the company's historical records. We've got 20,000 cubic feet, so 20,000 boxes of records that predate the company going back as far as 1808. So that's kind of part of my domain. So when I think about liberal arts and my kind of studies in liberal arts, I'm doing all of it right now. I do it all every day, whether or not I recognize it or not. I'm pretty sure that when I entered college as a history and education major, and so this was back in 1994, when I started at Monmouth College, I quickly learned that education really wasn't for me, so I decided to double down and become a history and classics major. And then, almost predicting my perpetual unemployment, I decided to add an art minor to that. So now I was a history major, a classics major, and an art minor, and I'm sure my parents were going, well, I mean, at least he's not home. At least he's doing something, and maybe someday he will get a job and not live with us forever. I'm sure that's what they were thinking. So I got through college, I graduated my degrees, I got a full assistantship to work on my master's degree at Eastern Illinois University. So I was feeling pretty good. I didn't know what I was really doing. I didn't know where I was going. But I had experiences, internships, working in archives, working in museums. So I thought that was my field. As part of my degree requirements, I had to do a 6-month internship or I had to get a job. And it was a a compressed program, so it was a year of coursework, very intensive. I had a cohort group of 10 people. We're nearing the end of that year. 9 people had jobs or internships. And I was thinking, well, what do I do now? Because no one's really beating down my door. I had interviewed for probably 6 or 8 internships and jobs. I didn't want a single one of them. None of them were in my area of interest. I was interested in 19th century American history. I was a Civil War buff. My senior paper was on the Civil War prison camp here at the Rock Island Arsenal. And here I was interviewing at children's museums and science museums, just trying to get my foot in the door to do something. So I wasn't incredibly excited about all of that. Well, then I had an opportunity come along. There was a startup archive in Alexandria, Virginia that was documenting the history of the commercial space industry. So for a 19th century American history person, commercial space, which in earnest started in the 1980s, was not that appealing to me, but it was also the prospects of actually working and having a job. So I interviewed for that, I got the job, and on the bright side I moved to Alexandria, Virginia. So for a Civil War buff, that was a big deal, right outside of DC, on the East Coast. So I was able to do a lot of things outside of work that were unrelated to my job. And I was excited, I had a job, I packed up my 2-door Honda Prelude, I sold my Ryan Sandberg baseball card collection that I'd been compiling since I was about 8 years old, so I had gas money to move out there, packed up all my worldly belongings, and moved out to Virginia. I took a whopping salary of $19,800 a year in 2000, which is not a lot. I lived in Fairfax County, which at the time had the highest cost of living in the United States. So I wasn't really living high off the hog. This all sounds familiar for humanities majors, right? This is your expectation. So I got a pretty plush apartment. I rented the basement of a house from a woman who spoke enough English that I knew that she was renting the basement of her apartment. I went and bought a lawn chair. I brought my 13-inch tube TV, and I bought a mattress from her that I found in the closet for $50. This was my accommodations for the next year. So, this was my expectation of leaving college, of what my entire life was going to be. I figured I would be in a pretty similar position 20 years from then, doing the same thing. And things were going pretty good. I was doing commercial space. It was interesting. I got to meet a lot of great people. The chairman of the organization was the president of a Russian space company, or the U.S. branch of a Russian space company. We had a U.S. congressman on our board. We had 2 presidents of other commercial space companies. So I had to live vicariously. I got to meet people. I was doing things that I probably shouldn't be allowed to do because I was fresh out of grad school. And that was one of the exciting things about working in this small startup. I spent the next year living in that basement, going to work. I worked every day by myself. My company was the radio, and I was cataloging records. I changed my title like 3 times because no one was there, and I realized I could. So every 3 or 4 months, I'd get a new business card. So I really advanced up the ranks. So that's one way to do it. Our last speaker talked about business cards. Print your business cards. You can be whatever you want to be. So I did that, and I thought, okay, well, this was a good start for me. Then our chairman went and, with a bunch of investors, bought the Mir space station. They privatized the Mir space station. 90% of our funding came from NASA. NASA pulled the plug, and a year later we were bankrupt. So now I went from grad school to basement apartment to working in the commercial space industry to finally kind of starting to get things going a little bit. One of my buddies from college moved out. We got a real proper apartment. I think we bought a 19-inch TV together, which was really a big deal for us. We even had cable. So things were really looking up. And then we went bankrupt. I was unemployed. I was looking for work. So that's kind of where I was 2 years out of grad school. Fortunately, my roommate's brother worked at John Deere. And he says, hey, Neil, they're hiring for someone in the archives here. You should look at it. And I said, no, I'm not moving home. If I move home, I'm a complete failure. Kind of the mindset of, well, if I go home, then I'm not making it on my own, and that was really important to me. Fortunately, I got thinking kind of long-term on what that meant. And I thought, okay, well, I'm an archivist. And I really identified with that occupation. That's what I wanted to be for a long time. I'm an archivist. I work in old records and old papers, and that's what I am. And I live in Fairfax County, Virginia, high cost of living. Best case scenario, someday I'm going to make $35,000 a year. These things don't really go together very well, so maybe I should entertain this offer. I went, interviewed, got the job, moved back to East Moline. I'm from the Quad Cities originally. I remember walking into the office the first day and just thinking, this is a huge, tremendous mistake. What am I doing? And I knew that because I thought I was a big deal. I lived in DC. Everyone's wearing a suit, everyone's important, no one's from there. Every day I'd go to a fancy coffee shop and just kind of live vicariously. Well, I moved back home. I moved in with my brother and his roommate in Fort Byron, if any of you know where that was. So it took me 15 or 20 minutes to come into East Moline and Moline, and I decided I was going to go get a cup of coffee, as if I'd never been here before and didn't know, what the Quad Cities look like. So I'm driving down Avenue of the Cities, looking for a coffee shop, and I go by a gas station and a gas station and a gas station, and I end up near Moline High School at Donut Delight, drinking an incredibly bad cup of coffee, eating a vanilla Long John, and in the booth next to me were two farmers in overalls. And that's when it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks of, okay, well, my career, all this study, everything that I'm identified with has brought me back home. My office was 6 blocks from my house and directly overlooked the field that I grew up playing soccer in. So I came home in a real way. So I was worried about my future. I was regretting my history major and my classics major and my art minor. However, I was confident about one thing. Despite me not feeling incredibly confident about where I was at that place, I knew I made the right decision. And that was something that I attributed to my liberal arts education. But I knew there was something kind of bigger on the horizon for me. If I kind of followed the path I laid out for myself and I just continue to work and I continue to improve and I continue to kind of take things as they came. And looking back 15 years later, it's easy to say, oh yeah, I had it all figured out, piece of cake, I knew what I was doing the whole time. Because you go from this in 1995, 1996, and I don't know how easy this is for all of you to see, but 15 years later, I'm able to point back and say, okay, well, liberal arts, this is what it's done for me. I didn't know any of this was coming, but 15 years later, I'm able to say, okay, well, that's me in India. About 4 years ago, I actually had an employee in India. That's me at my first book release with my brother sitting on the John Deere tractor. That's me about 6 months ago standing on a balcony with the White House behind me. This is in Ontario, Canada 2 years ago for a big tractor show that we were a part of. This is, some of you may know my wife Karen in the admissions office. That's us down in Texas a couple years ago because I got to manage a project where we built traveling displays for the PGA Tour, and we were talking about John Deere, so I got to coordinate John Deere dealers, our sales force, marketing people, actually design and build the exhibit. That's me in Germany a couple years ago, going to some trade shows. And then in the middle, that's me in the Coca-Cola archives a month ago, sitting on one of the American Idol couches. So 15 years later, I look back and go, wow, liberal arts, that's kind of important. That's allowed me to do a lot of amazing things. And that's, again, a little bit of what I want to share with you here, that I'm talking about the unknown. And I think the exciting thing about your careers when you leave here, about your future education, about everything in front of me is it's okay to not know where you're going. This is a time where you spend time learning what you're interested in, learning what you're willing to put up with, learning what you're willing to do to get that next opportunity. And for me, that big unknown is something that I was really terrified about. And I didn't really know where I was going to go from there. So, think about where the liberal arts maybe is going to take you. Hopefully, when we leave here, you can take a little insight from what I'm going to talk about. Hopefully, there's a little story here that you'll be able to look back at 5 years later and say, oh yeah, I remember Neil talking about that, and I was it sounded a little depressing at the time, but now I understand where he's coming from, and things get better from there. So ask yourself as you go along, can I make these choices? Can I make choices that matter for myself and my career? What are you going to do when you reach these individual crossroads? And this is how I've approached it. And this isn't something that came to me a year out of school or 2 years out of school. But as I've thought about my career and the development of my career, I've tried to kind of figure out what my personal values are. As I think about my career, what are the values, what are the things that are important to me? And the reason I do that is I want to know kind of where I want to be 10 years or 15 years from now. This is an interview question you're going to get. Where do you want to be five years from now? I think it's the worst interview question. I've never asked it because I think one of the great answers is I have no idea. But probably most people who ask that question are going to say, well, they don't know where they're going to be in 5 years, and that's a problem. I have the opposite view on that. So this is how I approach it, and these are kind of my career values. First of all, I think long-term trumps short-term. So think about these kind of divergent paths. You're going to come to places where you have to take that internship where you're serving coffee. The last speaker talked about internships and serving coffee. I think I was laughing when she said that because when I had my first jobs, I was getting coffee for people and I was bringing in the food. And then 15 years later, as I'm the manager of a large group, one of my main responsibilities is getting coffee and getting food for people because it increases productivity amongst the staff. So that was something that I came to, and so it's funny how these things kind of come full circle. But for me, long-term trumps the short-term. It's something that I keep in mind, especially as you get further along in your career, that you know there's a lot of risks you can take that seem really important at the time, but think about the long-term there. Second for me, and I think this came out of the liberal arts for me and just kind of the variety of studies is, for me, I have to love to go to work. I've got to be passionate about what I'm doing every day. Now, there's days you go into work, you know you got 8 hours of meetings. It's not going to be the most exciting, thrilling thing in the world. But figure out a way to make it thrilling and exciting. And if you can get some sort of job or career path or occupation that you just absolutely love, I think that really is the most important thing, at least for me. I got to do something that I'm passionate about, or I'm going to be bored, I'm going to be disinterested, and a lot of other things are going to happen that I don't want to happen. So as I think about jobs that I've taken in my career, that's been an important factor. Third for me is stability. Now, I know this does not sound incredibly exciting, that, wow, his ambition is stability. That sounds really awesome. But this is about my background. Growing up, my family was not financially stable. And I experienced that growing up, moving around and a lot of other things. So as I've progressed over my career, stability is important to me. So I think about positions not just in terms of, well, this is the impact right now today, but what's that impact 5 years from now? Of course, now I'm married, my son's 6 years old. The idea of taking a job in Germany and just taking off sounds really appealing, but there's other things at play now. So for me, what is stable to me? Those are things that I consider as I think about jobs, as I think about projects, as I kind of think about the strategic plan for my career and my life. And fourth, and again, this is the liberal arts in me, is I have to learn new things. People, some people like to go to work, they want to be told what to do, they want to be told what the result is, and that's fine. For me, I can't stand it. If I go to work and I haven't learned 20 new things that day, or someone hasn't brought me a lot of new ideas, I think that's a missed opportunity and a missed day. And that can be really terrifying and really daunting for a lot of people. And I see that every day in the workplace, that you can have a prescription for the day and you can go through the motions and you can show up and that's fine if that's your track. For me, coming out of the liberal arts tradition, where I was taking, I was reading Shakespeare, and maybe you're taking a business class or you're taking a history class, and then you're having to submit a painting for class. You're doing all this variety of things. That learning is incredibly exciting, and that's something that I continue to kind of take with me during the course of my career. So as I think about this career path, those are the things I think about. And again, this sounds like, all right, well, Neil's got it figured out. He's had this kind of forward trajectory. It's all mapped out for him. It's pretty easy. So let me talk about what happens when things get in the way. When this unknown kind of jumps out at you, what are you going to do? And again, this goes back to choices, and I'm going to share just a couple important ones that I've had to make in my career. So I was hired at John Deere in 2001. We went through the bankruptcy out in Virginia with the Space Business Archives. I moved home. I wasn't incredibly excited about it. But again, I identified as an archivist. I loved research. I loved history. I loved archives. This is what I was all about. And sorry, I'm gonna throw my wife under the bus here, but one of our first dates, I took her to a Moline Preservation Society meeting. She went out with me a second time, which is amazing. But, you know, when you're in love with your subject, when you're following a passion, you think everyone else shares that passion, and it was a good check for my ego to learn that not everyone else follows that passion, but sometimes those things work out too. That was my identity, and that was something that I worked really hard to build. So for me, for whatever reason, my parents took us to museums. When I was in high school, I was a Civil War reenactor. I volunteered at the Putnam Museum. I volunteered at the Rock Island Arsenal Museum. So I knew museums. I knew that was the path that I wanted to take. I started college as a history and education major because everyone was telling me, okay, you're going to study history, so you're either going to be a teacher or you're going to be a lawyer. And I knew that I didn't have the brain power to be a lawyer. And that was based on absolutely nothing other than I didn't want to be a lawyer, and I didn't know why. So I said, okay, well, I'll be history, and then the application is education major. Thankfully, I was put into a 6th grade classroom for 20 hours to observe, and that was the end of my education career. Because I stood there and realized that education was also about discipline. There were apparently kids in the room, which terrified me. And it wasn't a case where I got to just stand and lecture all day and everyone said, yeah, that's incredibly interesting. You're so insightful, and I love history now. And this is great. And then they came back and the next day. I learned in 6th grade that's not the way it is. And that freaked me out, so I left, and that's when I added the classics major and ultimately the art minor. Those are things that were interesting to me. So then I went to grad school, went through my job in Virginia, ended up in the archives of Deere, as I said. At the time, it turns out I was incredibly unhappy. I had a pretty good job. My salary almost doubled going from my job in Virginia to Deere, and I thought I was pretty set. And so I did the classic thing. I went out and I bought a new car. And then about a week later, I regretted that I went out and bought a new car because that doubling in salary was gone. So don't do that. Don't go buy a new car when it's your first job. But I continued to stick it out. The job was slow for me. The archive started in 1976. I was hired in 2001. I was the first hire since 1979. So everyone in that department, all 3 of them, knew everything. And everything moved really slow. They'd been there for a long time. And I'm in my early 20s, and I want to do this, and this, and this, and this. And the first assignment I was given was my boss said, well, go home and read this book. In 1984, there was a corporate history written on John Deere. It's 900 pages. And he gave it to me and said, read this book. This will get you up to speed on the company history. Well, a week later, I came back, and I said, I'm done. And he started laughing, and he said, okay, well, what's so funny? He said, I think you're the first person that's ever read that book. So he thought it was great, but I was ready for the next thing, and it just wasn't happening fast enough for me. So what I did was figure out all the ways that I could enhance my career and do things outside of the workplace. My job was okay, so I started volunteering at the Historical Society, at the Preservation Society. We were going to meetings. Ultimately, I became president of the Preservation Society. I got really active. I was giving speeches whenever anybody would listen, and especially if they weren't 6th grade students. So I go through Deere, things are going okay, I've got this upward trajectory. I work in the archives from 2001 to 2008. I was a technical archivist, I was a reference archivist, and I was a research archivist. I know that sounds incredibly impressive and amazing, but for me it was. And my lifelong dream at this point was to be a corporate archivist. I'd been to conferences, and I saw people with the title corporate archivist, and I'm like, well, for what I do, I work at a corporation, and I'm an archivist. So clearly my dream aspiration is to be a corporate archivist. But we didn't have one at Deere. But in 2008, that position was created, consolidated some positions. So now I'm in my 4th job in 7 years at John Deere. I'm 32 years old. I've reached the culmination of my career, and I was feeling pretty good about myself, patting myself on the back. Then I had a problem. I got offered a job. I got offered an interview in the corporate library at Deere. And the first thing my dad said was, wow, there's a corporate library at John Deere. He was stunned that a corporation would have a library. I think he was still stunned that they had an archive and that I was employed. But he was really stunned that I had the potential to go from an archive to a library in corporate America, pretty exciting stuff. And for me, it was one of those things where I looked at it. The position was a business information analyst, which sounded, so I'm an archivist, that sounded very boring to me. And I had no business background, so it was really out of my comfort zone. I was asked to interview, never really thought about my skills. I thought about my vocation, my identity. I was a historian, I was an archivist. Never really thought about the skills that I brought to the table. So I passed, said, no, I'm not interested, this is what I want to do. I've been in this job 7 months, that's where I am. So they hire someone, sticks around for 6 months, quits. They hire someone else, sticks around for 4 or 5 months, quits. So they've gone through 2 people in less than a year. I get contacted again. Hey, we really strongly encourage you to apply for this job. When someone says we strongly encourage you to do that, you should consider doing that. So I did. I considered doing it. And actually, the way it was positioned to me was, you've been at Deere for 7 years. You're in your early 30s. You've been in one department. You have no idea what's going on in the rest of this company. I've asked you twice. And if you say no, there's a pretty good chance no one's going to ever ask you to do anything again in this company. And to me, that was kind of a big deal, because I never thought about it in those terms. I never thought about the fact that I could have a life outside of the corporate archives of John Deere. So, I kind of thought about it, thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? I interviewed for the job, and the worst thing I thought could happen happened, which was I got the job. And then I had a decision to make. Thinking again, okay, well, I'm 32. Do I want to sit in this chair for the next 30 years? Is this the end of my career? That terrified me. It was something I'd never considered before because this was the job I always wanted. So I kind of thought about that, and that's what kind of prompted my decision to take on this job. So I go from downtown East Moline up to corporate headquarters. Everyone's important. Everyone's wearing a suit. Everyone seems like they really know what they're doing. Everyone speaks a language that I don't understand. They use this business vocabulary that I had no kind of knowledge of. If I had to do over, I'd take some business classes as an undergrad, by the way, as a humanities person. And I spent the next 6 months just absolutely hating everything about my job and hating most things about my life, and knowing that I'd made a terrible mistake. Because I sat in meetings, I didn't know what was going on. I was doing projects. I didn't really understand what I was doing. I was now doing financial spreadsheets that I didn't fully understand. I was doing translations from foreign currencies to US dollars for reports for senior leadership. And I knew that at some point someone was going to realize I was a fraud. They were going to realize that I didn't belong there because I was an archivist and things were going to go bad. So I did the natural thing, and I started looking for jobs outside of Deere, and I started trying to find historical societies I could join, and are there other organizations that maybe I could get hired on at? Because I was scared for what was to come, and was I going to now spend the next 30 years doing something that wasn't my passion, something I wasn't interested in? And that was a scary thing for me, because I'd been fortunate up to that point. And then something very, very strange happened. I kind of liked the job. All of a sudden, the words people were using started to make sense to me. I started to pick up on things. I was really terrified that the 2 people that they had hired before, apparently they were working 60 to 70 hours a week, and that wasn't that exciting to me. But 6 months in, I was doing the work in 20 hours a week, and I got to thinking, well, maybe I actually have some capabilities that I didn't understand. And maybe the manager who came to me and said, you should apply for this, actually knew what he was talking about, because he saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. He saw skill sets. He saw that I had an ability to consume large amounts of data, and I could succinctly summarize that, and I could present that to someone who was way more important than me. I didn't know I had that skill. I just thought I researched old records and made presentations. But he started to look at my skill set a little differently, and that forced me to look at the skill set a little differently. And so I got good at the job. I was able to turn that job into something else. And now all of a sudden, I went from history and archives as my identity to, well, people who do history and archives, they're really missing out because there's this whole big world here that I didn't know anything about. And you get to do cool things like I went to India, I went to Germany. I get to stand in the boardroom once a month and make presentations to senior leadership, and then they take that and actually do something that impacts a Fortune 100 company. I thought that was awesome. I had deadlines and I had pressures and I had all this stuff that I was doing now that I didn't even know that I had the capability of doing. Turns out I had been training to do that as an undergrad, a grad, and in the early parts of my career. So these things just started to come together for me for the first time. So that really first major important crossroads for me career-wise, where I had to basically sever 10 years of networking and connections and conferences I went to and organizations I belonged to. I quit all that in a period of about a week. And I thought I just never was going to recover. Turns out I got to do all that all over again. It was incredibly exciting. I got to learn all this new stuff, and that became a big deal for me. So I was a senior business information analyst. And then a couple years into that, we created a new position, and I got to manage a department we called research and analysis. So this was a very small group of online researchers that did business research to generate what we call insights for the organization. So our job was to discover things before any of our competitors discovered things, take them to senior leadership and say, this is something you need to know about so we don't get caught off guard. And the topics were all over the place. And it was very exciting and very interesting work because we were this kind of crack unit of researchers that operated off the grid. We basically had the budget to do whatever we wanted. We could buy research, we could perform our own research, we could hire out, we could generate these kind of ridiculous concepts and give presentations on things like, we gave a presentation in the boardroom on genetically modified insects and whether or not 50 years from now John Deere couldn't build sprayers anymore because people were going to actually just hire companies that created genetically modified insects for pesticides. And so we were like surfacing these completely random topics that were rooted in science and things that were going on. And here I am in history and classics, majoring in art minor, doing this sort of work, and it was very intriguing and cool, and I just kind of loved it. So all of a sudden I was part of the in crowd for the first time. When business development was working on something, they called us and said, what do you think about that? And that was very exciting. So now I had this whole new career trajectory. And then in early March of 2013, I get an email from someone 5 positions above me who said, can you come into my office tomorrow? So I said, yeah, because when you get that email, you say yes, regardless. And I went home and spent the night thinking about what I could have done wrong and why I was being fired and what I was going to do next. So that's what I thought. It never occurred to me that I was going to get a job offer the next day. But I went in, and the pitch was, well, so-and-so in the archives left the company, it didn't work out, we're reorganizing, we're folding in all these other departments. Do you want to go back to the archives and manage the group? That was Wednesday morning. He said, I need to know Friday, because if you say no, then we got to figure out what to do. So then I went home. I thought about it all afternoon. I went home and said, this is it. This is what I've always wanted. This is my new career aspiration. I'm not going to take the job. Because if I take the job, I'm back where I was 5 years ago, which is this the end of my career? I'm back in the archives. I'm back in that chair. It's the reason I left. And now I have this entirely new world open up to me. I've traveled the world. I'm really a vibrant part of the business now. I know what's going on. I know where we're headed. I'm really a part of something important. And when you work for a company whose goal is to feed the world, it's really hard to say, yeah, I can't really get behind that. It's not really that inspiring to me. But I'm part of a company that's their aspiration is to feed the world. And it was something I really bought into and I think is really important. So I thought going back to the archives and going back to history was going to be the end of my career. And so we kind of talked about it over the next couple of days, and what it came down to was, what are these values for my career? Stability. What's kind of the long term? What is my skill set? And that was really the important and determining factor for me. Was no longer was I identified with, this is what I am. I'm identified as a history person. I'm identified as an archivist or a historian. I'm the person who knows trivial facts that nobody is ever going to know, but you want me on your trivia team. I wasn't that person anymore. Well, I was that person. People unfortunately found out that I don't know a lot about history, I just know a lot about John Deere history, and if we got a John Deere history question, that was okay. But I learned that now all of a sudden I had this whole different worldview, and I had all of these skills that I didn't know that I had, and now the opportunity for me was, I wasn't going back to the department where I was the first hire in 25 years. I was going back to a department where I had been to the outside world. I saw what it was like out there, and now I could take that back and I could show everyone else there the promised land. That it was okay that you're an art curator and you got 2 master's degrees and you're the curator of the art collection, and you can take that and you can do a lot with it. And by the way, what our art curator is doing is our art curator is flying to Paris in 2 weeks to install a painting that's going to be at a museum there. So we have this whole new worldview, and so for me that was very exciting. It brought some of that passion back for me in a different way, because now the realization that came to me was, had I not left the archives in 2008, had I not taken that different path, I wouldn't have gotten that job. So what landed me, what turned out to be my dream job, I never would have gotten had I stayed in that very linear career path. And it just kind of blew my mind, to tell you the truth, that I thought, oh, all these people who told me this, first of all, I just now realize they're way smarter than me. And they already knew that. Why didn't I know that? That was kind of disappointing. But also, now I have the opportunity to take that back, hopefully open up minds of other people that are there, and do something new and exciting and reinvent ourselves. And we've done a lot of history at John Deere as a result of that. And based on this department of now, so 2 years ago, I had a group of 25 people, and we've reorganized and moved things around. Now I have a group of 6. So this is a lot of history degrees, it's a lot of art history degrees, it's a lot of master's degrees in art history. So it's all these people in a room at a Fortune 100 company. And by the way, companies do employ these people in a variety of roles. And we sit around and we figure out how to apply history around the world with a global approach for a Fortune 100 company. And that's something that I get to do every day. And we sit around, we talk about that. I would say about once every 2 weeks, I get an email from someone in the company that says, well, I was a history major and now I'm in IT or I'm in accounting, and I just want to send you my resume because I want your job. Your job is what I've always wanted to do, and if there's ever anything that opens up in your department, if I have to take a demotion or a labor grade decrease, I'm willing to do that because this is where all the cool stuff is. So for me, there's a great sense of pride in being in that position and having those discussions with people to again reorient them and say, okay, well, you're history and then you're IT, but what are your skills? What are you bringing to the table? What did you learn in those classes? What did you learn when you studied Plato or you read Herodotus? Like, what are you taking from that work, and how are you going to apply that moving forward? And I think there's obviously a lot there. So as I was preparing for this talk, I was doing a lot of research into the importance of humanities and the importance of liberal arts education. And there's this phrase I ran across, which is integrated education, which basically says that you shouldn't pick between humanities. You shouldn't pick between pre-professional studies. You shouldn't pick between those things and a skilled trade. In reality, you should be getting a little bit of all of that. And I think that's what the liberal arts is all about. That's the foundation of that. And what I found in my career, that's the most important thing to me. This desire to be curious, to want to learn something new. Sprinkle in there a little modesty that the more I know, the less I actually know. I learned that translating Plato for a year in school, and this was this is Socrates defending himself, saying, well, I'm smarter than all of you because I know that I don't know anything, and you all know that you know something. And that's something that I've kind of taken with myself along my career, that I think there's a lot of power and authority and influence in that, to know that you don't know the answer. One of the most important things I've learned to do in my career is to be the least intelligent person in the room speaking on a topic, because most people aren't willing to do that. And I take that back to the number of presentations I gave as an undergrad where I had no idea what I was talking about. So if nothing else, take that skill with you, because it may be the most important skill that you ever have, and it's probably what allowed me to advance in my career more than anything, is being willing to stand in front of a room and talk on a subject to get the dialogue going. It's an incredibly important skill that you're all learning in your classes. So as I reflect on all of this, for me it comes down to choices. What are the important choices that you're going to make? Are you going to follow your passions? Are you going to kind of take that leap of faith into the unknown? I would encourage you all to do it. Again, things are going to be okay when you get that out there in the world. You don't need to have a prescription. It doesn't need to be spelled out for you. You can be the last one in your class to get a job. You can move across country and sell your baseball cards. And you know what? 15 years later, you can go buy all those baseball cards again. They're worth a lot less now. But you can go out and do it again because you've got time. So these things come full circle. And think about that. What's this long term? What are you trying to accomplish? And if you don't know, that's awesome. Because if you ask me now what I want to be in 5 years, my answer is, I have no idea. I couldn't tell you what I want to be. Maybe I'll be an accountant in 5 years. Well, I won't be an accountant in 5 years. But I'm not sure what I'm going to be. I may be manager of archives and history like I am now. But that may mean a lot of things that it doesn't mean now. I may have a team of 100 people. I may have a team of one person. I may be running a research function. I may be in marketing. I may be doing competitor analysis somewhere. I may not even work for John Deere. And for me, that's the most exciting thing as I've kind of made this journey, is that the most important thing for me is I don't know what tomorrow brings, but the excitement of the unknown has now come full circle. All the things that terrified me, that made me scared to go to work, that made me scared to make choices because I thought it was going to be the most important decision of my life. It turns out, to this point, I don't know that any of them are. But I do know that I'm excited about what's to come, and we'll see what's to come. So, like you, I'm dying to know what's next. We'll see what's in store for me. I think it's up to each of you to figure out what's next and then what's after that. Take the plunge, get out there in the world, follow your passions, your hopes and dreams, all these things you hear, and just go do it, because this is the beginning for all of you as well. Thank you very much. So now's the fun part, which is questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have on my career, good decisions, bad decisions. Yeah.
Okay, how do you decide whether you should stick out something if you're not happy with it versus change path?
So,
like you talked about, you were in that job for 6 months, you didn't really like it at first, but you grew to like it.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you make that decision of whether or not you stick something out or don't stick out, and go on to something else? So the answer is, I don't know. I wish I could say, well, this was the criteria, and this was the right decision. The reality is, it's some of those things I talked about. For me, stability was important. That's a very easy way to look at it, which was for me, I lived in Virginia for 2 years, and I was so incredibly far in debt, I wasn't doing anything. I kind of think back now and I laugh, because something that used to happen in my building was the maintenance team would get together every Friday morning, and they would essentially gamble on NASCAR. So you go back into the shop, and they would pull numbers, and whatever number you pulled, that's the position that you got, the starting position. I know nothing about NASCAR. I don't understand it, I don't get it, I don't enjoy it. But I knew that maintenance knew everything in the company a week before anybody else did, and I knew that that was important for me to sit and listen to their conversations. I also knew that it was a $5 buy-in, and most weeks I didn't have $5, so I had to go to the bank and I had to trade in change so that I could spend $5 to gamble on something I didn't understand. The point of that story is, for me, it was at that point somewhat of an economical decision. I knew that I had a good job just based on the salary, I knew that I was in a department that had little turnover, so if I chose, I could probably work there for 30 years. Companies changed a lot since then, but at the time I thought, well, here's the stability that I need and that I want. So for me, that was part of the driver. And I'm a history junkie. Like I can't stand it. If it's old, I'm interested in it. And so I spent my days walking down the stacks, pulling boxes, sitting on the floor, reading letters written by John Deere in 1870, and pulling out correspondence from our CEO from 1950, and living vicariously. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever, that I was holding this stuff. And it also allowed me to kind of take that and turn it into other things. I've written 2 books. The first one started 6 months after I started working at Deere. So I spent that 6 months going, okay, well, here's my job. I found it to be pretty easy. It was tedious. But I found something else in it, which is I was naive enough to say, hey, I'm going to write a book. And I asked my brother to write a book because I found what I thought was a scandalous letter written about John Deere. Turned out 5 years later it wasn't scandalous. But I found stuff in it that I found exciting, and I kind of made it my own. That worked out for me to stick it out. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I don't know. You got to kind of look at all the information around you. I personally think that unless there's something really bad happening, if it's just that maybe you're bored or it's not exciting, I'd say stick it out a little longer and try to figure out how to make more out of it. The talk I have with my employees all the time is, it's up to you. As a manager, it's not up to me to make sure that your career is successful. It's up for you to do something. I gave you some tools and suggestions and resources. You got to do it. I did it through external sources for the most part and stuck it out and worked out. So, yes?
I thought your talk was really interesting, Neil. I'm a librarian here, but my first career for more than almost 20 years was in a corporate environment where I was in sales. And I found when I went to library school, most people think that that's so completely different, but it really wasn't. It was about thinking about the things that you're good at, the skills that you're bringing to it, a lot of the same things you're talking about, and you just apply it in a different situation. And I think so much of what we have to think about is flexibility and learning how to learn, because so many of us will do multiple jobs over the course of our careers now. It's not staying with one thing for a long time. So I think that kind of ties in with what you were talking about, and not to be afraid of that, but just think about those flexible and learning to learn kind of opportunities we have all the time.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just an example of that. I moved back to the archives in 2013, and I was excited to get back in history and do all these things. So the first project I was given was to build this traveling display that was going to go to 10 PGA Tour events. So I was picked to do it because I knew exhibits, I could write, I had taught myself Photoshop, I could work with the designers. But then I had the added opportunity of, you had to manage this budget, you had to do logistics, you had to work with all these people, so it was a learning opportunity for me. But it utilized all my existing skills. So I love the irony of, I was going back to history, finally, your job now is golf. It has nothing, like history, you're fine, you're gonna take care of it. But I want you to spend half of your day for the next year doing this. And those things kind of come about because you've got skills. As opposed to, well, I can read and talk about old-timey things.